My family mocked me for being a barista. They gave away my childhood home to my brother. Now, after I built a $10 million business, he's the one begging me for help with a store. Hi, my name is Paul. I'm 32 years old and live in a quiet neighborhood in Portland, Oregon. My best friend Brian and I currently operate 21 coffee shops across 5 states. We started this journey 5 years ago, working out of a small rented apartment with nothing but our savings. No loans, no support from family. Today, I have a stable career, a good income, and own a home worth around $600,000. Still, I choose to live simply. I don't talk about my success much, not because I'm ashamed, but because of something that happened 7 years ago. Back then, I was eager to prove myself and ended up saying too much at the wrong time. My dad and younger brother made sure I paid for that mistake. Since then, I promised myself I'd never brag, no matter how far I went. Especially not in front of my family. But last Christmas, I broke that promise. I let one harmless sentence slip, and that was all they needed. The same people who once looked down on me found the perfect chance to tear me apart in front of everyone. Early last December, Aunt Ingrid called. I hadn't heard from her in 7 years. After some cautious small talk, she asked if I'd come home for Christmas. I paused, ready to say no like I had so many times before. But then she said, "Everyone misses you." I couldn't answer right away. That night, I couldn't sleep. I wasn't sure if they missed me, or just the version of me that was easy to dismiss. Maybe I was curious. Maybe part of me wanted to believe things had changed. Whatever it was, I decided to go. On Christmas morning, I drove from Portland to Salem and arrived at 11 a.m. As I was parking, a familiar voice shouted from behind me, loud enough for the whole yard to hear. 7 years and you're still driving that thing? Guess nothing's changed. It was my cousin Peter, leaning against a brand new SUV with his arms crossed and a smug smile. I glanced at him, quietly exhaled through my nose, and smiled without replying. I hadn't come to fight. I grabbed the gift bag I packed the night before, some decent bottles of wine, nothing fancy, but thoughtful. When I walked into the living room, I spotted 2 familiar faces I hadn't seen in years, my father and younger brother. They stood by the Christmas tree. They looked at me for 3 seconds, then looked away. I didn't approach them. Instead, I greeted other relatives politely, asked a few questions about their jobs and health, and smiled just enough to be courteous. Aunt Ingrid came out of the kitchen shortly after. When she saw me, she took off her oven mitts and hugged me tightly. Her voice trembled with emotion but still had warmth. "Welcome home." In that moment, I wondered if this time might be different, if maybe, after all this time, I'd finally feel like I belonged. I had no idea it would end up being the start of another fall, this time in front of everyone. The celebration kicked off about 15 minutes after I arrived. I sat at the end of the table near some younger cousins. I realized it had been years since we'd all gathered like this. The food was traditional: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, buttery rolls, soup, and plenty of homemade desserts. Everything looked freshly made. I could tell Aunt Ingrid had worked hard that morning. She's my mom's younger sister. After Mom died nearly 10 years ago, Aunt Ingrid became distant. My dad was the reason. I remember a few times she visited after the funeral. He never welcomed her. He'd frown and say things like, "We don't need anyone's pity." Once, when my brother and I were happily chatting with her, he said, "If this is what the visit's about, don't bother. I can take care of my kids." After that, she stopped coming. Back to that Christmas day, about 30 minutes into lunch, as the room buzzed with laughter, Uncle Andrew turned to me and said, "So Paul, still working at the coffee shop?" The room seemed to freeze. All eyes were suddenly on me. He asked because, during a business trip to Portland 3 years ago, he happened to visit one of my shops. That day, 2 staff had called in sick, and the store was packed. So I put on the apron and worked the counter like any other barista. When he saw me behind the counter, he paused, surprised, but said nothing. I treated him like any other customer, brought his drink to the table, and didn't explain myself. I didn't think he'd bring it up again. But a few days later, I started getting mocking texts. Some with photos of me in uniform. I quickly realized where it started. One message from my dad read, "You embarrassed me." That was all. I didn't reply. By then, we were barely in contact. Now, 3 years later, Uncle Andrew brought it up again, ready to humiliate me in front of everyone. His tone was casual, but his eyes weren't. I sat still, hand on my spoon. But something in me shifted. Maybe it was my dad's glance, or the faint laughter nearby. I looked up at Uncle Andrew and calmly said, "Yes, I still do. But now, I co-own 21 coffee shops across 5 states." The room fell silent. Even the clinking of silverware stopped. Some people exchanged glances. Others just stared. Then Peter, Uncle Andrew's son, burst out laughing. He leaned back and said, "Oh man, listen to this guy. Sounds like one of those TikTok dudes claiming to run $1 million business." A few others chuckled. One aunt nodded and added, "Sure, but are you still serving tables? That part doesn't quite add up." Someone else chimed in, "Exactly. Anyone can say that. I could claim to own a 5-star restaurant if all it took was talk." The mocking spread around the table. Smirks, nods, quiet laughs. I looked around and felt like a clown in a show, with my family as the audience. But I wasn't embarrassed. I just looked at my father. He wasn't laughing. He didn't speak. He just stared at his wineglass, like he had just heard something he couldn't process. About a minute later, after the laughter faded, silence filled the room again. Everyone waited to see what would happen next. I sat there, calm, my hand resting on the chair. No anger, no sadness. Then, my father finally spoke. Just as I expected. His voice was low and measured. "You're embarrassing me. Who do you think you are, claiming to run 21 shops? Would you still drive that old car if that were true?" I turned to look at him. His face was red, and my father's gaze was locked on me, cold and unwavering. The tension around the table was so thick it felt like the air had frozen. Then, cutting through the silence, my younger brother Brody spoke. His voice was louder, sharper this time. "You're always like this. Always trying too hard to stand out. Working in a coffee shop, getting caught in uniform, and still acting like you're special." I didn't say a word. I just raised one eyebrow slightly and took a slow, steady breath. Suddenly, the sound of my father slamming his wineglass against the table echoed across the room. The sharp noise snapped everyone's attention back to us. Without warning, he jumped to his feet and stared at me like I was something disgusting that had crawled into his house. He shouted, "Get out of here and never show your face to this family again. You are a disgrace." And just like that, I knew I didn't belong here. Not because I was hurt, but because I finally saw it for what it was. These people, the ones who once called me family, had just been waiting for another excuse to cast me out. This time, they didn't even hide it. They did it in front of everyone, without hesitation. I slid my chair back, ready to walk away when a firm, steady voice rang out from the head of the table. "That is enough, Caleb. You should be the one to leave this party, not Paul. Remember, this is my house. You are a guest. You have no right to kick someone out of my home." The room fell completely silent. All heads turned toward Aunt Ingrid, who was now standing tall at the end of the table. Her tone wasn't loud, but it was powerful, sharp enough to cut through the noise and stillness alike. She looked directly at my father. Her eyes, usually full of warmth, held none of it now. She wasn't angry, but the way she held her posture, firm, unshaken, made the entire room feel heavier than any raised voice ever could. Then she turned to Uncle Andrew. Her voice didn't waver. "Andrew, I hope this is the last time you ever mock someone in my house. And Peter, teach your son some respect." Peter dropped his eyes to his plate, suddenly quiet. Uncle Andrew mumbled, barely above a whisper, I'm sorry, Ingrid." Only the people near him could hear the apology. I wasn't shocked by her words. I knew Aunt Ingrid saw everything. She just never interfered. But this time, she stood up for me, right there, in front of everyone who had treated me like a joke for years. Then she looked at me. Her expression softened. "Stay, Paul," she said quietly. "As long as I'm here, no one will push you around." I heard the sincerity in her voice. It wasn't a suggestion. It was protection. I nodded and looked at her with a gentle smile. Thank you, Auntie. But I have something at the shop I need to take care of. It was an excuse, and we both knew it. She didn't try to stop me. Instead, she sighed and said, then wait a moment for me. 10 minutes later, as I stood on the porch buttoning up my coat, she came outside with a neatly packed bag of food. She placed it in my hands and didn't say a word. That simple gesture, quiet, thoughtful, hit me harder than anything else that day. Not out of sadness, or even gratitude. It was that sharp ache of realizing someone in my family still cared. That someone refused to let me walk away empty-handed. 2 hours later, I arrived at one of our shops in Portland. Everything was just as it always had been. The hum of grinders, the warm aroma of fresh espresso, and mellow jazz playing softly overhead. As I walked in, a couple of the baristas behind the counter nodded at me. I returned the gesture with a small smile, the same one I'd worn for 5 years, even on the hardest days. As I approached the bar, Lucas stepped aside without a word. He knew what I needed. All our staff knew. On days like this, I always made my own coffee. 10 minutes later, I was sitting in my usual corner spot by the window, private, but with a view of the whole cafe. I took a deep breath and let the warmth of the cup in my hands ground me. After a few sips, the mild bitterness of the roast and the citrusy undertone began to clear my head. But as I looked through the glass, a memory from 7 years ago came flooding back. I didn't want it to, but today had pulled it from the past. I had just come home from work on a Sunday afternoon when I found my father in the living room. He was flipping through the paper, not even halfway in, and called me over. I need to talk to you, he said casually, like it was nothing. I sat across from him. Brody was in the corner, headphones on, but I saw him glance up. My father looked me in the eye and said, I'm leaving this house to your brother. He needs a stable place after he graduates. I sat there in stunned silence. I asked, quietly but firmly, what about me? He didn't even look at me when he replied. You already have a job. You make good money. You'll be fine. Your brother might not get lucky like you did. I clasped my hands in my lap to stay calm. Do you remember who's been paying most of his tuition this year? I asked. The guy who's only been working for a year, sending money back on the 15th every month? No one answered. Brody still had his headphones on, but he'd turned off the music. I could tell. I looked directly at him and said, You don't have anything to say? Without looking at me, he replied, It's Dad's decision. I'm not getting involved. I just nodded. That night, I packed up and moved out. No arguments. No goodbyes. It was like they'd all been waiting for me to leave. Since that day, I haven't returned. 7 years ago, I made the mistake of telling them how much I made. I had just landed a job at a finance firm, $70,000 a year after taxes. I was proud. I bragged. And I learned the hard way never to do that again. After my father told me he was giving the house to Brody, I didn't fight. I just packed my old college backpack, called a ride, and left. No one saw me off. No one called to check in. I rented a tiny apartment on the edge of Portland, more than 30 minutes from work. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Quiet, clean, and enough to start fresh. I kept living modestly, not because I had to, but because I wanted control. I cooked my meals, saved money, tracked every dollar. I didn't buy a house. I didn't buy a new car. I just built a cushion, for someday. 2 years later, on a quiet Friday evening, my best friend Brian invited me to meet at a cafe. He pulled out a draft of a business plan and said he wanted to start his own coffee shop. No cookie-cutter chain, he said. Something real. Something we build. He asked if I wanted in. At first, I hesitated. But when I saw the fire in his eyes, I knew if I didn't say yes, I'd regret it for the rest of my life. So I pulled every dollar I'd saved and said, let's do it. That's how we opened our first shop, Elm and Cedar, on a quiet corner in Portland. We painted the walls ourselves, built shelves from scratch, rented used equipment, and worked from open to close, every day. And we never looked back. Some days, it rained non-stop and we only sold 3 cups. Some days, the espresso machine broke down during peak hours. We'd be sore from working late the night before, but we still had to go through the books, line by line, down to every single receipt. Then the regulars started showing up. Some people came in every Monday morning like clockwork. Some claimed a corner of the cafe and never changed their orders the entire year. 1 year later, we opened our second location in Beaverton. Then came Salem, and then Seattle. Every new city taught me something different. We had to figure out how to hire the right people, manage them, and protect the soul of our brand, no matter where we were. And just like that, 5 years after leaving that modest apartment and making one decision I never regretted, we now run 21 coffee shops across 5 states. My phone buzzed faintly as I sat in my usual cafe nook, my thoughts drifting through old memories. A notification from Instagram popped up. I opened it out of habit, ready to scroll past whatever it was. But a few new comments on an old post made me pause. It was a simple photo of a coffee cup with the caption, "Slow Morning." I hadn't thought much of it when I posted it. But now, people were commenting, and not in a good way. One person asked if I was still bragging about my fake coffee shop empire. Another mocked me for still handmaking drinks, saying, "What a humble CEO." I stopped reading. My chest tightened. Just then, Luca, the barista on duty, walked over. He looked worried as he gently pulled out his phone and said, "You should see this." I think you need to know." He handed me his phone. A new video had just gone up from a group called Family Drama. The first frame froze me. It was taken during our family lunch at Aunt Ingrid's house. The video had been edited down to the moment I said I co-founded 21 coffee shops. Then came the laughter, mocking comments, my father shouting, "Get out of here and don't ever show your face again. You're a wrecking disgrace." The title hit me next. Paul Hart claims to run 21 coffee shops and gets tossed out for lying. As I scrolled, the view count was climbing fast. So were the comments, most from strangers who acted like they knew me. I handed the phone back to Luca. I didn't feel ashamed. I felt something all too familiar. When people don't know the full story, they believe the loudest voice. 20 minutes later, I shut down all my social media accounts. I didn't want to argue with strangers who had too much time and too little understanding. Silence felt like the right choice. Not long after, my phone rang. It was Brian. I had just set my coffee cup down when his name popped up. "Did you see what people are saying?" he asked, his voice rushed and worried. "Yeah," I replied calmly. There was a pause. Then he said, "You saw it and you're still this calm?" I took a breath. "What do you want me to do? Give it a few days. This'll blow over. You drive me crazy sometimes," he said, angry. Then he hung up. I didn't blame him. Brian's never understood why I stay quiet during moments like these. He believes everything deserves a reaction. But that's just not me. Some things are better left unsaid, for the sake of peace. The next morning, my phone buzzed again while I was making breakfast. It was a message from Brian. "I took care of it for you." Below was a link. I clicked it. A new video had gone up on the same Family Drama page. This time, Brian was the one in front of the camera, sitting in one of our cafes with the company logo behind him. No fancy editing, just a phone recording, but his words were firm. He said his name, confirmed he co-founded the chain with me, and held up our business license, photos of our shops, and even a magazine interview from last year. At the end, he looked straight at the camera. "He doesn't owe anyone an explanation," he said. But I think it's time people heard the truth. When I finished watching, I wasn't emotional. I just knew Brian wouldn't have done this unless he was truly upset, for me. I texted him right away. "Thank you for everything you did." Then I looked at the comments. The video had thousands of views within 30 minutes. This time, no one was mocking. People stood up for me. Someone said, "Editing a video just to humiliate someone, especially family, is disgusting." Another added, "I don't know him, but the paperwork looks real to me." Still, others remained skeptical. Why stay quiet yesterday and only post proof now? Seems a little too convenient. Even with facts, his tone at the party did feel arrogant. I wasn't surprised. Social media never decides truth or lies. It just shows who controls the story. So I went back to my routine. I still made surprise visits to the stores. Still stood quietly at the bar. Still asked a few questions and left without making a scene. I thought the storm had passed. But exactly a week later, it came back, this time from the last people I wanted to see, my father and my brother. It was Tuesday around 9 a.m. I was reviewing payroll when my phone rang. It was my dad. I didn't even hesitate, I declined the call. 1 minute later, a message came through. Your dad and Brody are waiting at the Portland store. If you don't show up, we'll keep coming back. I stared at the message. I wasn't shocked. I decided to go, not to talk, but to listen. When I arrived 30 minutes later, they were already in the back corner, the quietest part of the cafe. As soon as they saw me, they stood up. Their faces looked tense. I'm sorry about the other day, my dad said. Me too, Brody added. I'm sorry. I didn't waste time. Say what you came to say. Brody jumped in. We're still family. Can you give us 10% of the company? Or maybe just one store each? Dad's getting old, and my job barely pays. I didn't speak for 5 minutes. Then I looked them both in the eye and said, go home and wait to hear from my lawyer. They thought I had agreed. They expected contracts and transfers. What they got instead was a legal shock. After they left, I called Eric, our company lawyer. I told him everything. His reply was simple. Leave it to me. It'll be done in 2 days. And it was. 2 days later, Eric confirmed the letters were delivered in person. The documents were a formal cease and desist order and a legally binding no-contact agreement. If they interfered again, we would sue. And even selling Brody's house wouldn't cover the damage. Later that day, my dad called again. I answered, just to hear his tone. You bastard, he shouted. Is this how you treat your father? I answered calmly. I don't have a father. You've got the wrong person. And don't forget what my lawyer said. Then I hung up and blocked both of their numbers, not out of anger, but peace. Because I knew their rage came from disappointment, not pain. They expected something. They got nothing. The days that followed were quiet. Peaceful. No more calls. No more guilt trips. I went to work. Sat in my usual cafe spot. My coffee was just hot enough. And for once, I wasn't worried about who might walk through the door. Some will say I was harsh. That I should have forgiven and moved on. But forgiveness doesn't mean you let people walk all over you. It means you know when it's time to stop. I didn't shut the door. I just stopped opening it for people who only show up when they want something. If I've learned anything, it's this. Don't share your success with people who ask out of calculation, not care. Silence isn't weakness. It's protection. Peace doesn't come from control, it comes from keeping the wrong things out. And before I end today's story, I want to ask you something. If you were at that Christmas party, with everyone mocking you, would you have stood up and said the truth? That you co-own 21 coffee shops? Or would you have stayed silent to keep the peace you've worked so hard for? Thanks for watching. If you enjoy family drama stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one.